us or listening to the recording of this presentation about systematic screening for behavior disorders, or for short, SSBD. My name is Randy Sprick, and I have the distinct privilege of opening this session and doing a brief closing at the end. My materials, Safe and Civil Schools materials, are published by Pacific Northwest Publishing, and my background is mainly working on intervention and prevention of behavior problems, and as part of that work, I did develop a set of tools and data systems that are published by Pacific Northwest Publishing. And one major gap in that material was material for universal screening. And in looking at developing universal screening, it's a very daunting task. And in looking at the great work of Drs. Walker, Severson, File, and others, the work that they have done in developing the SSBD is truly incomparable. And when Pacific Northwest Publishing had the opportunity to be an outlet for the SSBD, it was such a natural fit with the work that I have published through Pacific Northwest Publishing as well. And as part of that, I did ask to go ahead and do the introduction for this, because I am so convinced that the SSBD needs to be part of district or schools' efforts to meet the needs of behavior problem kids. And the SSBD is considered to be the gold standard of universal screening. Any of the reviews and things that you will read, they will talk about and compare different screeners, but they're almost always compared against the product called SSBD. And so I want to just briefly preview some of the benefits that you will be hearing about from Drs. Walker and Severson about the SSBD. And in doing a brief preview, I just wanted to mention that there may be different participants who are listening to this webinar, either live or to the recording. And whether you're a district administrator, a building-based administrator, a teacher, or a school psychologist, school counselor, or perhaps school social worker, SSBD has the potential to be a big part of the services that you provide in meeting the needs of all kids in your district. And some of those benefits, one of the first and most powerful is that the SSBD utilizes teachers' knowledge of their students to identify student needs before a crisis occurs. And without the use of a validated tool like the SSBD, traditionally, students at risk of behavior problems and their teachers only get support after some formalized referral process or some major crisis has occurred. And a second benefit of the SSBD is that it does reliably identify students who have the potential to be exhibiting internalizing and externalizing disorders. And the screening procedures effectively use teachers' knowledge of students in order to take the guesswork and subjectivity out of identifying who might benefit from additional support. In other words, part of the technical adequacy that the developers have demonstrated is that teachers do have tremendous knowledge about the needs of students, and that utilizing that knowledge has the potential in a very reliable and valid way to identify the needs of kids earlier than otherwise would be able to happen. And the advantage of early intervention early intervention has to begin with early identification. And just a quick and almost silly metaphor for this, if you're leaving the center of the country, which is basically Wichita, Kansas, and you're trying to get to Florida, if you notice 5 miles out of Wichita that you made a wrong turn and you have to backtrack 2 or 3 miles to get on the roads that would lead you to Florida, that's pretty easy to do. On the other hand, if you are trying to get to Florida from Wichita and you find yourself in Maine because you haven't done an early identification of the problem, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of money in order to get yourself to Florida. And so early intervention is going to be less intensive and more effective than allowing social-emotional difficulties to percolate under the surface. And particularly for the problem of internalizing students, those needs may go unnoticed for a very, very long time, and hence help in the form of some kind of intervention or support could be equally delayed. A further benefit of the SSBD is its efficiency. An entire school can be screened in about 45 minutes, meaning each classroom teacher, the impact on him or her is only 45 minutes, not for screening each student, but for doing the screening of their entire class. And so the amount of impact on any individual staff member is actually less than many screeners would be. And the online version also has the further advantage that all of the scoring and report development is also automated, which makes it much lower impact on the school psychologist or the school counselor or the building-based administrator who would need to be scoring of the protocols of the print material. And then a final advantage, after which I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Hill Walker, who will later turn it over to Dr. Herb Severson, is that in the second edition of the SSBD, it's expanded grade levels through pre-kindergarten up through 9th grade. And there is this powerfully developed, wonderfully validated tool that can be highly efficient and really utilize the knowledge base of your teachers to identify the needs of kids in ways that go beyond just that teacher's gut instinct about the needs. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Hill Walker from University of Oregon. And Hill, as one of the lead developers of this material, has for decades been doing this great work on utilizing the SSBD as a vehicle for identifying kids who are potentially at risk of both internalizing and externalizing disorders. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Hill.
Thank you, Randy, very much. Thanks also to those of you who are attending this webinar or participating in this recording. By way of introduction, I'd just like to note a few facts about the challenges of dealing with today's K-12 student population who have behavior problems and disorders that disrupt schooling for themselves and others and impair their social emotional adjustments and development. Schools today are responsible for educating each student who enters the schoolhouse door. But the challenge of doing so effectively has never been greater. There's enormous diversity in the backgrounds, beliefs, attitudes, and actions of today's students, making it more challenging to accommodate all students effectively. Far too many of our students begin their schooling careers coming from severe at-risk backgrounds where they're exposed to many risk factors and very few offsetting or buffering protective factors. It's estimated that approximately 22% of K-12 students today have serious emotional and behavioral disorders that impair their school performance and that of others. And contrast this with the slightly less than 1% annually of the K-12 student population who are referred, evaluated, and ultimately certified as eligible to receive supports under IDEA, the federal legislation governing special education and related services. EBD is by far the most underserved category of disability, but it has the worst outcomes of any category. For example, within 3 years of leaving school, whether graduating or leaving without a high school diploma, approximately 75% of EBD students have been arrested at least once. Experts in juvenile crime estimate that there's 1 arrest for every 10 arrestable offenses committed, so you get some idea of their risk status. And further, when vulnerable students are out of school when they should be in school and they're on the street, their overall risk status can skyrocket. There is some good news, however. Schools are now much more invested in the prevention of negative destructive outcomes among K-12 students than ever before due to an emphasis on school retention and dropout prevention, egregious school violence, and targeted school shootings of students and teachers, such as happened in Sandy Hook Elementary nearly 2 years ago. And finally, reform pressures to make schools more effective. All of these factors have contributed to school personnel becoming much more interested in retaining and preventing students from dropping out. What is the role of universal screening in all this? If you want to forge an effective prevention agenda, it requires universal screening as a first step that should begin as early as possible in the student's career, and that becomes a routine practice across school years. As to the cost of behavioral problems to instruction, it's nothing short of huge or enormous. Approximately 40% of K-12 teachers today report losing some instructional time to classroom behavior problems. 17 to 21% of students have reported losing 3 to 4 hours per week of instructional time to disruption. When you multiply that times the number of weeks in a typical school year, that's a huge amount of lost time. An additional 19% of teachers report having lost 1 to 2 hours per week of instructional time to disruption. So it's a very, very costly phenomenon. Further, more and more students are being suspended or expelled from school due to their chronic behavior problems, and that includes preschoolers. The idea of expelling a preschooler because of behavior problems strikes me as an anomaly, but it's a practice that is fairly widespread. Use of psychotropic drugs to manage the behavior of K-12 students is also on the increase, and these drugs are often prescribed for social emotional problems, depression, and anxiety. Student violence towards school staff has become a serious national product. Student anger, abuse, threats, and physical assault now involve collectively 12 to 15% of K-12 teachers and staff. So the proactive benefits of universal screening for behavioral risk, as Randy noted, are well established. The SSBD and substantial research by other professionals have demonstrated that when teachers are provided with clear criteria and well-developed tools, they can accurately and reliably identify students likely to fail in school due to behavioral challenges. And one of the great advantages that teachers have is as they teach and manage classrooms of students, they are constantly able to make comparisons within and among students, and it increases their information base to make reliable, accurate predictions and discriminations among students. Early identification provides an important gateway to a healthy social-emotional path for our most troubled children. Early intervention can then lead to fewer disruptions in the classroom and increase learning outcomes for all students. As Randy noted, early identification allows intervention to be applied to identified problems very early in their progression, when it's more likely that we will see positive changes the earlier we choose or are able to intervene. Large numbers of students can be screened in a very short time with universal intervention approaches such as the SSBD. Also, the SSBD gives each student an equal chance to be identified for the two major problems and challenges that students experience in school, and that is externalizing problems that involve acting out and aggressive oppositional forms of behavior, and internalizing problems that involve self-related, internally directed problems such as phobias, anxiety, social withdrawal, isolation, and peer rejection. These two dimensions, externalizing and internalizing, account for most school behavior problems that we see. Best practices in schools in dealing with students in general, and in particular students at behavioral risk, should involve combining proactive universal screening with universal interventions that can have an impact not only on the whole class, but can further identify those students needing more intensive behavioral and academic interventions. This slide shows the major approaches to screening and identification of at-risk students that we have typically used in schools. Teacher referral has been the dominant way that students access services for years and years and years, but it's highly variable across teachers. So you can have the same student go through 5 different teachers in a school day, and have those teachers assign very different priorities to the nature of the child's problems, and whether or not referrals of them should be made for specialized evaluation and access to services. Universal screening addresses this problem by providing a standard set of behavioral criteria and nomination and rating systems for allowing teachers to evaluate students proactively and to look at them in terms of how they measure up against standard behavioral profiles such as internalizing or externalizing. A less sensitive way of identifying students is to implement a universal intervention and then to look and see which students aren't responding to it. That's a much less sensitive method of identifying students. A very cost-effective, proactive, highly efficient method is proactive universal screening using multiple gating methods where students are nominated initially and then the highest ranked students are moved to a second level of assessment, and in some cases those who exceed cutoff points and behavioral criteria in the second screening stage are referred to an optional third stage involving different assessment methods such as observations. So each level of screening confirms the previous level. So a child or a student who makes it through 2 levels of screening or 3 levels of screening is very likely to have serious problems. This slide provides a graphic illustration of the 3 gates of the SSBD. So stage 1 or gate 1 involves teacher nomination of students whose typical behavioral characteristics most closely match either an externalizing or an internalizing behavioral profile. And then the highest ranked students from stage 1 move to gate 2 or stage 2, where the teacher rates them on a series of brief behavior rating scales and what we call a critical events index. These instruments and measures are nationally normed, so the cutoff points on these are well established and allow you to determine which students are at greatest risk. And then stage 3 has typically involved behavioral observations conducted in classroom and playground settings, and or a school archival record search. So if you are interested in more thorough screening, stage 3 is available to you, but it's optional. It's not required as part of the screening process. So this slide gives you a look at the definition that the teacher receives of externalizing, and then we provide examples and non-examples of the definition so that the teacher can have a crystal clear idea about the standard, the behavioral profile that we're wanting them to compare each student against. So the teacher nominates, for example, the 5 students in her or his class whose typical behavioral characteristics most closely match the externalizing behavioral profile. Then the teacher rank orders those 5 students from the one whose characteristic behavior matches it most closely to the one ranked 5 whose characteristic behavior pattern matches it least closely of the 5. The top 3 students then go on to screening stage 2. This slide does the same thing for internalizing. And we, in developing the SSBD, Herb and I spent an awful lot of time on the internalizing behavioral definition. It was fairly easy to get teachers in agreement and reliable on the externalizing behavioral profile. But on internalizing, we had a lot of trouble coming up with a definition that teachers could agree upon and use to nominate and rank order students. There's much more behavioral overlap between non-problem behavior students and internalizing than there is between externalizing and non-behavior problem students. Go ahead. So this is the exact same procedure for internalizing. The teacher nominates 5 students who have internalizing behavioral characteristics, and then rank orders those 5, selects the top 3 to move on to gate 2. Go ahead. This is what we call the critical events index. We think it's important to look at student behavior not only in terms of the frequency with which students are expected to do certain things or not to do certain things, but also to look at severe, highly intensive forms of behavior that you only have to do once to have a huge social impact and provide a signal that you're in trouble. So these behavioral events have been referred to as behavioral earthquakes, and they really are. They have a huge social impact. They're difficult to predict. They do a lot of damage and require long periods for recovery. The average score of a general education student on this 33-item list is well below 1. So the go ahead for next slide. Okay, the combined frequency index in screening stage 2 involves assessing adaptive behavior, that is where the items are equally divided between adjustment to teacher expectations and to peer expectations. We think teacher and peer adjustment are 2 of the most important social behavioral adjustments that students have to make in their school lives. We also assess maladaptive behavior. If you can see, that's maladaptive. Can you show the adaptive? Okay. I'm sorry about that. The adaptive behavior list is not in this slide sequence, but it has 12 items that describe appropriate behavior that teachers expect and that peers expect, respectively. And then the maladaptive student behavior form that you see displayed consists of items that disrupt teacher and peer relationships. We like to refer to this combined frequency index as the Obi-Wan Kenobi goodness and light side of human nature versus the Darth Vader evil side of human nature. Go ahead. At the pre-KK level, we have additional 2 very brief rating scales that the teacher completes. Externalizers engage in a lot of aggressive oppositional behavior, and this checklist provides additional information and assessment of the nature of the externalizer's aggressive behavior who may make it through screening stage 2. And then for internalizers, we're interested in how they respond to peers and also how they respond to group activities that are controlled primarily by peers. So these are valuable, brief, additional rating scales. Advantages of the SSBD, many of which were noted earlier by Randy, include being closely aligned with the 3-tiered service delivery system of RTI. The SSBD has almost a 30-year record of research and evaluation by the authors as well as other professionals. It has excellent psychometric characteristics that are described in a DVD in the SSBD packet that I think is 140 pages in length. It identifies students who are very often under-identified or ignored in terms of their needs within school, that is, those having internalizing problems. Often they are considered the best behaved students in a teacher's class. The SSBD manual provides reproducible forms also for scoring and interpreting results. And the online version, which Herb will discuss in a minute, produces these scoring results and reports automatically. So that's one of the many very attractive features of the SSBD online version. As Randy mentioned, screening procedures are now available for pre-K through grade 9 and instead of just grades 1 to 6 and a separate system, the early screening project for preschoolers as before. It's available in both online and print. And there are approximately 7,000 new normative cases to add to the 4,400 existing normative base. And the regions across the U.S. From which these new normative cases were drawn include the Northwest, Mountain States, Midwest, Southeast, and South. So, thank you. And Herb, if you can talk about the online version, that would be great.
Thank you, Hill, very much. Hill covered most of the key elements of both the rationale and development of the SSBD, as well as much of the research that's gone on in establishing its credibility and its use. What I'd like to now talk about is the online version. And this is a new option that provides easy administration and scoring of the SSBD. And this is brand new, and we're very excited about it because we think it's going to broaden the appeal and use of the SSBD and make it a much more useful tool. The development and testing of the SSBD online was started when Hill and I were funded by the National Institute of Health on an SBIR grant. This is a grant that was coming from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and this allowed us the support to create a web-based prototype of the SSBD. And it was our intention then to develop it and establish its credibility, viability of doing it. Fortunately, we were able then to pair up with the Pacific Northwest Publishing Company after this, and the company put in a great deal of support and time and energy to taking what we had as a prototype and really developing the full SSBD online program. Additionally, they supported extensive testing and evaluation, and this took much longer than we anticipated, but I think the result is a very robust instrument that's been very reliable and stable. This extensive testing and evaluation has made it clear that the online version is easy to use, has clear instructions, lots of help screens, and can be done very independently, and that's really a key element for this. Let me review some of the advantages of the online version of the SSBD. I think the first is simply convenience. This can be used rather, and completed 24/7. That is, any time of the day that is convenient to the teacher. She or he can go online and complete the screening. Essentially, all that's required is the ability to have a web connection, that is internet connection, and log in and complete the instrument. It's also flexible. That is, we can send the screener to any teacher, school, or staff by email as an invitation, and that invitation invites them then to log in and participate in the screening process. Hill has already alluded to the automatic scoring, and here the screener is scored by the program, and immediate feedback is provided to the teacher and administrator. This is a great boon because with the paper version, typically what happens is the teacher completes the screener, but a professional has to take the scoring sheets away and complete the scoring and provide the feedback. This is all done automatically on the online version. Also, it generates reports. These reports are compiled by the program and include specific recommendations that are unique for internalizers and externalizers. Other advantages are the ease of administration. I've kind of referred to this already, but this removes the need for a professional person to administer or supervise the screening. While the SSBD can be done in group administration and typically takes only 45 minutes to an hour at the most, even with a group administration, here it does not require your school psychologist or other professional to be there to supervise the screening and to do the scoring. So this reduces the burden on special staff and really facilitates screening to be done more frequently and more broadly. The last point here under advantages is simply tracking data. As I'm going to show you later, there's some examples where you can compare the screening that is done in the schools either by classroom or students across time. This facilitates multiple screenings in a given school year. We often recommend that the initial screening be done about 30 days after the students have been in the classroom. This allows the teacher to have a stable observation base on which to make her judgments. But after that, we also recommend a mid-year screening, typically in the winter, and then a spring screening, which allows further assessments to use in planning for the following school year. So again, the advantage here is that you can do multiple screenings and you can actually see the data, allowing you to compare the screenings across time. And this is another benefit that's kind of similar to that, and that is the data can be shared easily. That is, the child study team can be given access to the scoring and the report, and this can allow them then to plan for further assessments or plan for interventions. Here again, the data is facilitated because you can provide a link to the report and to the scoring to members of a child study team. So let's take a brief look now at how the SSBD online version works. I think Hill has covered very clearly the multiple gating procedures, the idea of rating and ranking students on dimensions of externalizing and internalizing, and then subsequently completing stage 2 measures, which are the critical events, adaptive and maladaptive behavior scales. But let's talk about how the online version specifically works. There are really 3 levels to think about here. At the first level is a district administrator. The district administrator chooses the schools that are going to participate in the screening for that school district, and by email invites the school administrator to participate. Essentially, that is often the principal of the school, but it could be another person in the school who has been willing to act as the administrator of the screening process. The school administrator then, this is an administrator at the school level, subsequently invites teachers to complete the screening. This means that the school administrator enters the name, the classroom, and the email address of the teacher, and the teacher is then invited via email to participate in the screening. So both district and school administrators can monitor the completion of screenings. That is, they will actually have a dashboard in which they can monitor whether the screenings have been completed or not, and can send prompts to teachers if they haven't been completed in a timely fashion. Administrators are also alerted to any significant at-risk behaviors. In the critical events list, there are behaviors such as mandated report items, such as signs of abuse. Those items are specifically then alert, if they're indicated by the teacher during the screening process, the administrator at both the district and school level are alerted that these mandated report items have been noted, and they receive the report of this and can subsequently intervene or take action. I've now selected some screen examples. These are screen grabs actually from the SSBD online to make a few points about the process. In the first case, what we see is a dashboard, and we call this a dashboard because the administrator can look and get a data on terms of the number of classrooms that have been screened, and in those classrooms, how many students have met criteria as externalizers, how many students have met criteria as internalizers. And as you see in the example here, if you go down to Melrose Elementary, you see that there were 11 screenings assigned, 7 have been performed. Of those that have been performed, you have 11 externalizers, 13 internalizers, and 6 mandatory report items. You can see in some schools that they've been assigned, but that hasn't actually begun yet. In the case of the Apple Academy, which is the first row, you see that 8 screenings were assigned, 2 have already been performed, and so on. The advantage of that, and then if you were to click the view, this is not active here, we're just seeing a screen, but if you were to click on the view screen, you could actually see the view in detail of that school. Also, you can see the big button here, add a new school, and so the administrator has the opportunity to add a new school. I do also want to point out the parental consent button at the top. That provides examples of how to provide information to parents that you're doing the screening, and we provide sample letters that can be copied onto your letterhead. And we use what is known as a passive consent procedure for this screening, but obviously if this, we leave it up to the school to decide what kind of consent procedure to use. In a passive consent procedure, we treat it pretty much as vision and hearing screening. That is, we want to inform the parents that the school has decided to participate in a system-wide, school-wide screening, and the purpose for that. And if the parent is opposed to that, then they can either call the school directly or send back a prepaid postcard so that their child is not included in the screening process. One thing that we learned early on is that we needed to provide lots of help screens, and so if an administrator or a teacher wanted some specific information, more information, either about the background of the instrument, the process of its development, or instructions on how to conduct the screening, we wanted to provide that and make it easy to find. So this is a sample help screen. There are videos, and we made videos both for the district administrator, and we also made a video for the teacher, in which, again, the process is described, and we've gotten very positive response on these videos because they give kind of a nice background and orientation before you're using the online version. This is a welcome screen for the teacher. So the teacher has received the invitation to do the screening. They've logged in, and now they have the opportunity to begin. You can see the blank box here with the TV. That would have been an orientation overview that they can click on and see a video. And what it's doing is just giving a nice description and orientation to the process. And then the teacher would click on Begin Screening, and up would come Stage 1 screening process for them to begin. Again, we've really tested this extensively with teachers and with districts to make sure that whenever anyone gets stuck or has any difficulty, that it's pretty transparent and pretty easy to use. So we've put a lot of effort into making this as easy to use as possible. The district level information, in this case, the district has been participating in screenings. For this year, you can see in the fall they did 79 classrooms were assigned, and it shows the number of externalizers and internalizers that met criteria. This is a district level dashboard that gives a quick overview to the district in terms of how the screening is going. Notice that, as I recommended earlier, you're doing a fall, winter, and spring screening. You can see the fall and winter are complete, but the spring is probably not yet complete because we've only had 45 classrooms screened at this point. Again, same choices here with reports you can see, and also adding new schools. Again, this is at the district level, and this is their dashboard. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that the online version generates reports. And these reports are available then to the teacher and the district level person. And here what you see is the children that were identified as externalizers and internalizers in this teacher's classroom, and the date of the screening. And what the district administrator or school administrator would do is simply click on View Report, and they would see all of the scoring as well as the recommendations for intervention and further assessment. Notice that one of the buttons here is red. This is Frankie Allen. And the reason for the red is that means there's a reportable item. So this child has had a reportable item and the report items are report being sexually abused or showing signs of physical abuse. And so that indicates a mandatory report item was found for that child. This is an example of the scoring that one would see on the online version. This is the SSBD student report on this child. I noticed that in the big boxes here down below under scoring, you can see that 2 critical events were noted. The adaptive behavior was 29. The maladaptive score was 40. Red means that meeting or exceeding criteria. And in this case, you can see on maladaptive, it exceeds criteria. And you can see on a red also an adaptive. That is, the adaptive score was below the criteria of 30. And critical events, obviously 1 or more is important here. And normative comparison shows, again, that 2 were noted. And so this child met criteria in all 3 of these areas. And this is kind of an explanation of the scoring as well as a pretty simple example of the scoring. Now, as I mentioned, there are resources that are available. In addition to just the scoring, what we try to do is provide a report of recommendations. And in addition to that, there are resources that are available to the district. And what we have provided is suggested resources or next steps, either for conducting individual or group intervention, additional assessments or progress monitoring, and the SSBD is excellent for progress monitoring, and or targeted assessment. So again, we've tried to make this kind of an independent, standalone tool that can be a great resource. It isn't just the screening itself, but what do you do after the with the screening information? How do you move forward to benefit this child? This is an example then of a dashboard showing the individual schools. This shows the school administrator. On the left side, you can see the name of the person that is participating. And again, active status means that it's active. They're actively involved in the screening at this time. And again, you can opportunity to reset the password if the teacher forgets the password or administrator forgets the password. And you can change status or edit user. Again, the idea is to provide a lot of flexibility and a lot of power to the individual user, and again, provide a lot of information that facilitates this being an active tool for this school. And I think this is the final one. And here, what you're seeing is some color coding. Notice that in the first student, Ella here, was a kindergarten female externalizer, and notice that the red boxes indicate the level of risk. That is, we've assigned color coding, red being extreme risk, orange being high risk, yellow being some risk, and green not at risk. to give you a quick indication without having to translate those numbers. You can quickly look at this child and notice that the screening, the first one is the screening in the fall. The next series of boxes is the screening in the winter, and then subsequently the child was also screened in the spring. Notice that there's been some improvement in some of those scores and moving from high risk to low risk. This gives you a quick view of the students in that school who have been identified, and then you can also look at their status across the year. Again, another tool that was requested by school administrators to make the information easy to use. This information can be exported to an Excel spreadsheet, and it can be used by the district as an assessment tool for assessing at-risk status within schools or classrooms. So we, again, are making every effort to make this a valuable tool for the school. Again, thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it now back to Randy, and he'll talk a little bit more about what to do with this information. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Herb, and thank you also, Hill. I'll just take a very few minutes because I realize we're at the hour point, and just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the incredible value that can be gained from this information if it's actually utilized. So one thing certainly that can be done is to make some determination if your initial focus is going to be predominantly on universal prevention versus targeted intervention. If, for example, you have a lot of students who meet the criteria for being at risk of either internalizing or externalizing, you can look at, well, we can certainly set up support systems for those kids, but we may stretch our resources. So if we're going to focus on universal intervention, the information from the SSBD can help you tailor your staff development. Let me give you an example. If you have quite a few students who are identified as potentially at risk, you can examine the trends of the critical events checklist and the adaptive, maladaptive scales that were filled out by the teachers. And so I'll just quickly give you two examples of what this could look like. In School A, there might have been a lot of students who were rated low on some of the items, such as expresses anger appropriately, for example, reacts negatively, and the item goes on. And another item which says complies with teacher requests and commands, and they could be rated high on problems like behaves inappropriately in class when corrected, for example, shouts back. Well, if the trends of a fair number of students had problems with those items, you could build a staff development plan focusing on providing teachers with strategies for both teaching and reinforcing compliance and following directions, but also teaching and reinforcing students for anger management. Now let's contrast that with School B, where maybe those items weren't particular trends, but in School B there were quite a few students who were rated low on items like follows established classroom rules, and rated high on some problems like tests or challenges teacher-imposed limits, for example, classroom rules, and on an item like creates a disturbance during class activities, for example, excessively noisy, and so on. Well, were that to be the case, staff development could focus on general classroom management, including teaching expectations, establishing and reinforcing rules, and perhaps even using whole class or other group-based reward systems for meeting classroom expectations. Likewise, if you're looking at an individual student, you can look at the forms that were filled out, the Critical Events Index and the combined adaptive, maladaptive behavior scales that could be used to align the level of support with the severity of the problems, which students seem to have the most urgent needs. And along with that, you can analyze those subscales to identify the behavioral content of intervention. Does this particular student need to learn anger management and self-control as compared to or along with compliance, as compared to or along with social skills training, following classroom rules, different attention-seeking behaviors, or on-task and other work-related behaviors? In other words, the information derived on an individual student from the SSBD can help direct you toward what types of intervention focus would be of the most benefit to the student. Now, there were a couple of questions that came in that I'd like to address, and again, I'll be brief on this, but if you have other questions, please feel free to contact Pacific Northwest Publishing, and they'll direct you to Donna Mears, and you can either do this through an email to Pacific Northwest or calling the number that's indicated. But as I leave this screen up for just a moment, let me respond to a couple of questions that did come in during the webinar. One is a great question, and that is there a legal obligation to provide services if a child is identified as potentially at risk of internalizing or externalizing? And the first response to that, of course, has to be check with your district attorneys about that, because your district may have some policies or procedures. And also, if you truly suspect a child has a disability, an emotional behavioral disability, you may need to begin those referral processes immediately. But with that said, I think the best way to think about this is to think about vision, hearing, or even initial screening for reading difficulties. If you do screening for vision, it doesn't immediately mean that you start, if a child looks like there might be a problem in that screening, you don't immediately start referral for visual impairments. You probably are going to recommend to the families and or the school providing support for getting a more formalized vision check by a vision professional. Doesn't mean that immediately, based on the screening, that the child is going to be labeled as visually impaired. It just means there may be a need that we need to collect some more information and or start some processes for getting help for a child. Another question that came in was how much training is involved, and that's the lovely thing about the work that these gentlemen have done is in the administrator's guide, there's definitely self-study material, and as Herb was alluding to, in the online version, there's videos, there's documents, etc. So there's no formal need for outside training. And then the last question that I'll respond to, and then I'll just do a very quick conclusion, is why would one use the SSBD, which does have a cost involved as compared to some of the free screeners that are out there? And while the free screeners can be some valuable tools, they tend to be referred to as skinny screeners. They're very definitely just a quick broad brush view, is there a problem? And they definitely will not provide the level of depth for guiding you toward intervention, either in terms of universal prevention or in terms of intervention for a child who passes out, meets the criteria for stage 2 as being potentially at risk. Those tools that Herb and Hill have developed really drive you directly toward interventions that would have great potential. So in closing, thank you so much for your time, and if you'd like more information or a free demonstration of the online version of the SSBD, give Pacific Northwest Publishing a call or go directly to Pacific Northwest Publishing website and ask for more information or a demo about these valuable tools. Again, thank you so much for your time and for your interest.